Hey guys, in this video we're going to focus on our texture set and texture set settings. Now typically once we kind of get into Painter with our new model, this is going to be the first step I kind of go through. It's kind of like doing some of the prep work before you start creating your materials and textures. So the two areas we're looking at is going to be over here on the right side. We have a texture set section and texture set settings. Now texture set, you can kind of think of this as sort of the material you're currently working on. Now notice how the name is called neutral gray, and you may remember this word earlier in one of the previous videos when we exported this out of Maya. We had that warning pop up where it mentioned, hey, I don't know what this neutral gray RenderMan material is, and then it said we're going to use a Lambert instead. So what you're seeing is it's pulling the name of the material and basically applying that to the object. So the material name at the moment, and you can think of material name and texture set as basically the same thing, it is calling itself neutral gray. Not a huge deal, but later on when we export this stuff out, we're going to want to have this called something different. And I kind of like to use the texture set to auto name our textures. So I want it to, like when we export these out, I want it to be called book color, book normal map, book specularity, book roughness. And I want the book name itself in the textures so I don't get them mixed up with all the other objects we're working on. So with that in mind, so every object isn't called neutral gray something, let's just double click on it and let's call this book. Okay, let's kind of get out of that. Let's go to the button right below it. This is texture set settings. Now this is the same area where you could change the resolution if you wanted to. So we might come back to that later. That's very important though. Below that you can see we have some different channels. These are going to be the channel properties that match the preset that we picked. So remember when we did that new project, we started with that template called PBR Metallic Roughness. This is what the PBR Metallic Roughness uses. These are the different material properties: base color, height, roughness, metallic, and normal. It's a really, really good preset. So we're going to kind of use this because it's basically the standard now for almost every renderer, whether it's a software renderer like RenderMan or V-Ray, or even getting into something like a game engine where maybe you're going into Unreal or the CryEngine. So really good format, but eventually we are going to have to convert some of these textures into a format that RenderMan wants to use. But for now, leave all this the same. Now the big reason why we're in here at the moment isn't because of any of this stuff, although it is important to know what that means. Really the key here is going to be down below where we see mesh maps. So mesh maps are sort of these utility maps that tell Painter where the object sits in 3D space, what the normals look like. Is there occlusion, which are kind of like contact shadows? What's the curvature look like of the model? These are really important because later on, when we start doing things like our grunges, or we start using smart mask or smart materials, they feed off these mesh maps, which means we could have like edge detail that automatically wears down the leather on all the corners instead of us hand painting any of that from scratch. So for now, what we're going to do is we're going to hit Bake Mesh Maps. New window pops up, and there's a lot of stuff in here. We're not going to have to worry about very much of this at the moment. Now the output size is kind of optional. I'm going to put mine to 2048 just because that's the same resolution we're working in. But typically you probably could go a little smaller, like to a 1024, and it would still work totally fine. But we'll do 2048. Don't worry about changing any of this other stuff right now. On the left side though, we want to pick which types of mesh maps we're going to use. Now there's nothing really wrong with baking all of them, but I kind of just like to bake the ones I know I'm probably going to use. And the ones we're using for today are going to be World Space Normal. I can turn that one off. We don't need ID. We do want ambient occlusion. I want curvature and position. We can also disable thickness. This might come up later in another activity though. Same as ID. So World Space Normal, ambient occlusion, curvature, position, change the resolution. Everything else you can just leave default and then hit Bake Book Mesh Maps. This might take a second here. Okay, you'll notice this whole area has now changed. I can see there's not just an empty slot, there's a texture here, World Space Normal. ambient occlusion, curvature, position. So there are maps here now that didn't exist previously. Now if I go up in the shelf and look under textures, you can actually see where it's dropping them in here. These are the baked mesh map textures kind of hanging out within Painter. There's the occlusion, curvature, position. Now you can also see these on the model if you are curious what they look like. So if I kind of go to this little drop down here, you can see we're currently looking at the material. These are material properties, which aren't going to do much yet until we make a material. But below that, we have our mesh maps. And now you could click through these if you want to do it that way. Like world space normal, there's one of the maps. Here's ambient occlusion. You can see it's kind of contact shadows. Okay, here's the curvature, showing me how the object is curved, almost like your bevels. White showing, exterior curves. Then we have these kind of interior curves as black. That could be very useful for putting dirt and scratches in certain areas. Now, if you ever want to kind of go between these and back to the material, instead of going through this little drop down here or on that side, instead what we're going to do is use hotkeys. So I'm going to hit M, which brings us back to material. Now, to cycle through the mesh maps, it is going to be B. So if you hit B on your keyboard, it will cycle through all the mesh maps. Now, a couple of those you can see aren't doing anything because we didn't bake ID. We didn't bake the thickness map, so it kind of shows like a transparent kind of checker texture. But don't worry about that. It's totally fine. But it is a nice way to kind of toggle through these a little faster if you want to see them without constantly clicking up inside of the menu. So at this point, we've got the material named, got our mesh maps built. Now in the next video, we're going to start assigning some material presets and kind of have fun matching the reference.